We're going to start with whatever questions you may have here as students, anything that's not clear in the latest material or any material beforehand. And then if there's no questions there, I might answer some of the questions I got by email, and that way it's going to be on video and I won't just be writing it back. Might be easier for those people to understand. And quick announcement, which is not an announcement because I don't know what's going to happen, but there is talks that maybe we might be switching to red zone at some point, and if that were to happen, maybe we're going to switch our approach for the remainder of time. I have no power over that. Just know that regardless of what happens, I'm always there for you guys. So if ever we're not able to meet in person, if you have any questions or anything, like write me, and if I get a bunch of questions relating to a topic that is not clear, or maybe even just one, I might make a quick video out of it and then post it for everyone to kind of learn from it and keep on improving. So make sure, I know like some of these classes, you guys have questions and it kind of directs the flow of the class, but sometimes you don't, and I could just make similar videos to what I would make here in class at home as well. So anyways, we'll see what happens once we get there, but it's just something that may happen. Any questions before we get started? No? So today we're talking a lot about long-run equilibrium and introducing that whole concept. One thing to note, I guess may have confused some, and I think it's partly my fault because I kind of forgot to do something that I was supposed to do. Every single chapter, every single edition of this textbook that I've used up to the new one that just came out had a certain amount of chapters, and this one has one more chapter. It's not that it has one more, it's just that it split two chapters into one. So if you have the 7th edition or before, fiscal and monetary policy, which will be the topic of next class or next week, is one chapter. And the new edition kind of splits it into two separate ones. So at one point in the slides or in the videos, you might hear about the 5 questions in chapter 17. Well, if you have the new textbook, it's the 5 questions in chapter 18, because there's like an extra chapter that's kind of introduced itself there. There's not necessarily more information in the new textbook. They just kind of split it into 2, which kind of makes sense, but if you see them both at the same time, it's not really a big deal. It's 2 different ways that the government can intervene when we're going through financial troubles, like a recession. And they're completely different, but they have the same kind of objective. So they're quite similar at the same time. Yeah?
So we need to read 2 chapters for next week?
So if you have the newest textbook and you want to follow the textbook, yes, in a certain way. But at the end of the day, we're nearing the end in the sense that chapter 17, there's 5 questions of what used to be chapter 17. I mentioned that it's something important to cover, but in the past that is not, I've often said in class that like this won't be evaluated necessarily. And at one point, it's a little confusing because at one point in the class, you'll have like a pre-week quiz that deals with that. And my notes kind of cover some of that as well. The only reason why it's a little bit different is that the way I present and the way the textbook kind of orders things up, it's a little bit different. So even if you don't see notes of myself of chapter 17, but you see a quiz that has chapter 17 in it, which is the old one, which is making it even more confusing, but before it wasn't as confusing. Well, in that situation there, don't feel like you need to read that chapter to be able to do it. If you've done all the previous chapters beforehand, like all the information that you need to know to answer those questions is from the previous chapters. So I don't have specific notes for that final, whatever, if it's 17 or 18 chapter in there. And as far as I'm aware, does someone have their textbook with them? What's chapter is fiscal and monetary policy? Is it 14-15 or 15-16?
It's the opposite. So monetary is 16 and fiscal is 17.
So 16, 17, and this would be like 18 now. Okay, so today we're covering 15, right? I believe so. Yeah. Okay. So on the point of view that you have to cover 2, 14? 14. Okay. Sorry. We still have like. You're sure it's 16
No,
and 17?
it's
15 and 16.
15 and 16.
Yeah, because there's another
17.
chapter
Yeah.
before the end. Yeah, so 15,
Trade-off.
16, and then there's inflation trade-offs afterwards, which is a short chapter. So
And then there's 18.
yeah, but the 18 is the one I say that the way I present it is embedded in all the other chapters. So I don't have specific material to cover for that specific class. So in reality, we have today 14 and 15, next week 16 the week after, and 17 the week after. So whether we combine these 2 as one or not, you still have enough time to go on a pace of like 1, let's say, chapter in a book per week. But for sure, for the notes, you won't have more notes to look at if you look at my old notes that combines the 2 together. So from reading in the textbook, it might be a little longer to cover that small segment, but for everything else, it's just the same as any other week. Okay. So that's pretty much it. So there's 5 questions from the last chapter. It's cool to read it if you have the textbook. It helps you understand things better, and it could help you answer certain questions. But if you don't have the textbook or you don't read it, you won't have a question that's in those chapters that has never been discussed in my notes or the videos. It will never be the case. So don't worry about it if you don't have it. Okay? Any other questions, clarifications?
When do we get the practice proctor exam?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I was thinking about that actually earlier. I was thinking before doing a practice proctor exam, I do a practice, which would be it would be kind of like an extra pre-week quiz that would be like a super easy question to answer. Like I could give you guys ahead of time, but it would just be a practice to kind of get the flow for it. Would just be a 1-question thing. And then probably the final online quiz, the final Friday quiz, that one will be using Proctorio as well. So that one will be evaluated. The other one would be kind of more of a bonus than anything. And then the final exam.
Okay, up to date, we've been having multiple choice questions. I'm guessing that's not going to be like that on the final proctor exam. I mean, that's kind of hard to practice for. Like, what are you looking for?
Yeah, so that's the challenge this year. I haven't done it yet. So far in the past, I was kind of keeping up to where we were. Now I've covered everything except the final exam. So everything's prepared for me on my side except the final exam. And the final exam, since we're doing it online only, I'm trying to create questions that would resemble what would be normally my long answer questions, but in a multiple choice or kind of format that's easy to use within Moodle. So I'm going to revise my old classics, let's say. Like I have a bunch of them, but like I'll revise some of them and I'll create an alternative to. So you'll have probably more multiple choices that you normally have, and you might have some that are like, if we think back to chapters such as inflation, you might have a question that the answer is just you filling out the answer. So normally in a long answer question, you'd have like A, B, and C. Well, these might be 3 separate questions. And this one could be like calculate inflation using the CPI approach and give me the number up to this amount of decibels or whatever in percentage term. And you write it and then that's your answer. And then this could be something else and this could be something else. So I'll probably kind of use the computer side to my advantage, but it will still resemble, like I don't want it to be just pure usual multiple choice questions.
And because it's proctor, we'll be videotaped, and if we have a piece of paper beside us taking notes and doing graphs and trying to calculate things, how is that going to look like? It's like we're studying in a book.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that one actually. I'll let you know in the next week or so just to make sure that that's clear, what you're allowed and what you're not allowed, and how could we kind of run the system so that everything works out. Because I wouldn't want it to be that you're using like notes. But obviously, if it was a paper exam, you would be able to draw out a graph. So I'll probably allow, like the way it works with Proctorio, I haven't used it yet, but the way I understand it is that we're allowed to kind of set thresholds on a bunch of different things, and then people get flagged or not. And so I could have a threshold that's not so bad on certain things and worse on other things. So.
Or like looking at a calculator, are you looking at your calculator
Exactly.
or cell phone?
Yeah, exactly. So it wouldn't have to be too bad. And then on all of that is always the trust issue, the challenge for sure. But as long as you can't have like access to your full computer and everything else is already removing a lot. So we'll see. Yeah. And if ever you do get flagged, like it doesn't mean that you yeah, exactly, like flag cheater. That's not how it's gonna work. So so keep that in mind. Then there will be a judgment call from my part. But at the end of the day, like for me as a past student, like the thing I really despise is cheaters in life, just because I find as soon as there's cheaters in anything, it just makes the value of your diploma and your degree and everything else just not really worth much, because someone who cheats through and doesn't understand anything could apply for the same job as you and then gets it and then gives a terrible reputation to their university. So I really despise cheaters. And from my point of view as a student who works hard, I worked hard when I was a student to get really high grades, and to see someone getting the same grades as me and not understanding the subject would piss me off as well. So I understand that. So I want to have things in place to remove cheating to the maximum for sure. And I rely on your trust and everything else for the rest. But I don't want to like fake cheaters, which are unreal and just using things. I don't want you to dock you off anyways on it too. So I'll try to find the right balance. Yeah. So who knows? You might get flagged or you might not get flagged. Don't cheat and you'll be fine regardless. So that's the kind of moral to the story. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm just going to pull out my computer real fast just to kind of look at some of the questions I got. One of them I know deals with a topic from other weeks, and I just want to cover it because to me it's pretty obvious, but okay, so the question was a multiple choice question which said, which statement is consistent with and above the equilibrium exchange rate of the dollar? So the way I kind of explained it, and I'll explain it again here, is regardless of if I'm talking about exchange rate or I'm talking about price or I'm talking about anything else, like the same logic will apply. So here, if I think about exchange rate or price, I'll probably have some form of demand curve. I'll have some form of supply curve. It could be a demand for dollars, supply of dollars, or it could just be demand and supply if we're thinking microeconomics. And I'll have an equilibrium price. And here's a hint, like there's many ways of answering multiple choice questions, and I know some people despise them. And that's fair, but maybe at some point in your life you'll have to go through like a really hard multiple choice exam that is very quick to answer. And the better you get at it, the better it is for future. Like I don't know if anyone here is studying finance, but like when I was here, I did finance and then I did my CFA exam the following summer after graduating here. Well, the CFA exam is like 120 questions in the morning and 120 questions in the afternoon, 3 hours. So you have like a minute and a bit per question. And it's hard questions, it's like bang, bang, bang. And I remember studying, I studied like over 200 hours for the exam. I did the practice quiz. And in the morning, I was only able to answer 90 out of 120. It was just about getting faster at it. So it's finding tricks to get fast, but also finding tricks to answer well. So when I see a question like this, I find that some people just go through all the answers too thoroughly. So if I look at the answers here, I see the first one is like, quantity of dollars supplied is less than quantity demanded, dollar will appreciate or depreciate. So what I can see is they're talking about quantity demanded, quantity supplied, and price going up or down. I just look at the first one and I know that's what's going on. I personally, if I see a question like that, I try not to go through all A, B, C, D. I ask myself, well, I know what the general question is. What can I say about this problem about over the equilibrium price or exchange rate? What can I say about this? Well, I know that in any graph that I have supply and demand, whether it's a price or exchange rate, if the price is over the equilibrium, my quantity supplied will be greater than my quantity demanded. And because of that, whether we're talking about exchange rates like currency or we're talking about a good, we have here an excess supply. That might not be part of the question, but it's still interesting. And an excess supply, when businesses accumulate inventory or someone accumulates a certain currency, will have a tendency to lower the price of this good. So over time, when there's this excess level, well, we're going to have a tendency to move towards this equilibrium stage. So the price will go down. So in this special case that we're talking about exchange rates, I was talking about it generally, but this would be a greater quantity supplied than quantity demanded for this currency, which will lead to the currency to depreciate. That's pretty much it. So if I look through the questions afterwards, I see these ones like quantity supplied is less than, no, that's not true, And I keep on looking and I see quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded and the dollar will depreciate. Boom, I have my answer. I already figured it out in my mind. I look for the right answer and then you have a higher chance of success in that way. If you know your material and you would have been able to answer it in a long answer format and you do it this way, you're more likely going to be successful. Otherwise, you're just going to look through and you're just going to trip in the words because you're kind of stressed by the exam and it will kind of make sense and then you'll stop there and you won't even read the other ones or something will happen. So the more you do multiple choice quizzes, try to find techniques, tools that makes you more successful. So that's one of them. It doesn't mean it works for all of you, but that's one I use. I look at the question, and I'll often do this when I review an exam. Look at the question, look at one of the answer to see where they're going with it, and then I'll try to figure out the answer without looking at them really precisely. That's one way I do it. Any questions with regards to that? No? Okay, this student has more questions. I'll go to that later. Actually, I'll go to it now. Okay, so some people are confused why AS curve or AD curve may shift left or right. So let's just try to clarify all of this here. There's a lot of information in the slides, and there's some information you don't need to know as well. But so here you have like real output or national output. It could be Y or quantity. And then you'll have your aggregate demand. You'll have your aggregate supply, which you could refer to it as AS or SRAS. And you'll have your long run aggregate supply. And this is kind of your stable long run situation. Okay? Because on long run aggregate supply, this is where you have your what you call either Y star or Y hat. And it's a potential output. Depending on the textbook you use, the way it's represented could be a little different. So I don't know which one, I forget which one it is in this textbook, but potential output. So potential output doesn't mean that we're dealing with the maximum you could produce. It just means that this is the amount of output that would be produced in a well-functioning market. So imagine that, I always try to break this down to something much simpler. This classroom is all of Canada. And I get you guys working at producing several different goods, or just one, doesn't really matter. Well, potential output is what we would produce if you guys are all working like normal work weeks. That would be my potential output. If some of you guys are slacking off or you're not working or anything else, or lost your jobs and just trying to find a job and not producing anything, well then we'd be below potential output. But there's always the flip side that we can be above potential output. If I have all of you guys working 60, 70 hours a week for me, I can produce more than if you were all just working 40 hours a week. So that's why even though potential output exists, that doesn't mean we can't surpass it. It's what a well-functioning economy produces. So when we think back to unemployment, well, here we would have only natural unemployment. Different textbooks will refer to this different ways, the natural unemployment, the NIRU, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Essentially what we're saying here is that it is normal to have some level of unemployment. Like in Canada, we've never really seen a period where we have 0% unemployment. Everyone has a job. So it is normal to have some level of unemployment, to that is not cyclical in nature, that's not due to a recession. It's just people are kind of transitioning between jobs. That's fine. It's not like what we're going now that some people have lost their jobs due to COVID or due to another financial recession in 2008 or whatever. So we have some natural unemployment and we have the rest of the people working like 40-ish hours a week. That would be a situation that we're in a well-functioning economy, stable economy. And we'll kind of come back to the idea of why I say that's stable versus if we're on the left side of this. So anywhere where the intersection between YD and AD and AS are to the left of here, we're going to be saying that this whole range here is a recessionary output gap. And anything to the right of this will be an inflationary output gap. And the LRAS can move, but in pretty much all my examples I give in exams, it doesn't move. We're keeping that as steady because it's not something that typically moves too much. So what would make my LRAS curve move? Okay. So if I think of the classroom example, this is potential output. Let's say we're all producing shirts. Well, how many shirts we could produce a day? Well, what could really alter what this whole population of Canada, which is here, produce in a day? Yes? A recession will not impact how much we can produce. It will impact how much we produce, yes. It's a short-run thing, but it doesn't impact our kind of potential if we were producing to the normal level of output. So you see there's a distinction there. The recession is a short-run situation where potential output is kind of like if things were going well with who we have here, this is how much we could produce potentially.
Expectations?
Not quite here either.
New technology?
New technology, yes. So technology can have an impact. Sometimes I keep it simple and I just have technology shift the short-run curve. But in reality, yes, technology would also shift the long-run curve because if we have new technology in producing shirts and on a given normal 40-hour work week, we can produce more than before, yes, the level of output that we expect is higher. And then the other big things that would have an impact is if for some reason like half of the people here died, like our potential output wouldn't be the same. If we lost half of our population, wouldn't be the same. Same thing goes if we had like a ton of people coming from other countries because there's wars going on in other countries or Donald Trump would have been reelected or anything else. We would have had more people here and all of a sudden in that situation our potential output is greater if we have more people as well. But generally speaking, if there's no major shifts in technology, because technology moves, but maybe not that quickly in the whole grand scheme of the economy, and there's no major shifts in population, LRAS is pretty stable overall. Okay? So that's why in most examples I'll give, I won't make it move. But then what changes is the short-run curves. And those short-run curves will change if we're going through a recession or boom or whatever. They'll have reasons for them to change. So that's what we have to understand here. So one of the example that I think we discussed earlier was the example of what happens if the price of oil goes up, right? So if the price of oil goes up, so like oil, we mean like anything that deals with petroleum-based products for fuel and other things that could be used for energy, heating, electricity generation in other parts of the world. So this is a major input of production. Even if you don't have creating a petroleum-based product, if you use electricity and you're in somewhere where they generate electricity through oil, or you have a certain amount of shipment comes from like Asia, your raw materials or something else, well, there is oil being used. So even though your product is not made of oil, the price of oil has an impact, okay, on your cost of production. So if I think about this, well, oil has an impact on what? The supply side or the demand side? Yeah, so this has an impact on supply side, or on AS, because this creates an increase in input costs. Okay. Just out of curiosity, how many people here have done or are currently doing microeconomics, ECO103? Okay, so part of you have done it. For the other part, you should have seen like just basic supply and demand, hopefully, because I kind of gave you that review available to you at the beginning of the semester. If what I'm saying here and about to say a little bit more is foreign to you, I definitely suggest you guys covering that, because this segment of class that deals with aggregate supply and aggregate demand is very closely linked to supply and demand. So here, price of oil goes up because it's an input cost. It's the supply curve that's going to move. So in microeconomics, we talked about the things that shift the supply curve the most are input costs, and then you can have like maybe new entrants, or if you have severe droughts or other things like that, it can influence supply. But typically, it was mostly input costs and technology that would shift the supply curve the most. Whereas the demand curve was different things such as income, change in taste, price of related goods, and everything else, because we're looking at one good at a time. I'd say for macro, for this class, when we talk about AS, the two major things that we're going to talk about that shift AS are changes in input costs and changes in technology. And for AD, think back to any of the components of GDP. If there's a change in consumption, investment, government spending, exports, or imports, any of those things change could have an influence on aggregate demand. Okay. So that's why we're going to see that when we cover fiscal and monetary policy just as a kind of preview to it, we're dealing with changes in interest rates, and the goal of this is to change investment. So a classic example is to drop interest rates to stimulate investment. Investment is part of this. Therefore, as you stimulate investment, aggregate demand is going to shift right. Whereas fiscal policy is going to be talking about increasing government spending. Government spending is here. It's going to shift aggregate demand to the right. Or it could be a drop in taxes, which leads to more disposable income, more consumption. More consumption leads the aggregate demand curve shift to the right. Okay? Changes in interest rates, we could even go beyond that and say that changes in interest rates will have an influence on currency. What would a drop in our interest rate do on our currency? Like now we're trying to connect the dots a little bit more, but based on what we've seen so far, a drop in our own domestic interest rate would lead to more money coming in or less money coming in than usual. Drop in interest rate, less. Less money coming in. Less money coming in leads to an appreciation or depreciation of our dollar. Depreciation. Our dollar is valued less. What's going to happen to exports? Is it going to favor our exports, or is it going to hurt our exports if our dollar's worth less? Favor. Favor. Our dollar's worth less. We're cheaper to buy. Our currency is cheaper to buy. So a drop in interest rates stimulates investment, but it could also stimulate exports, and it would drop imports, so stimulates net exports. Okay? So we could see all of these are kind of... No. You have an increase in exports and you have a drop in imports, and we always keep in mind that net exports is exports minus imports. So if this is going down on its own, it will increase net exports as well. Both of them are leading to a bigger increase. It's like a small increase and another increase in net exports. Because if you plug any number there, start with 50 and 40, we had 10. If I increase this to 60 minus 40, I have 20, which is bigger. But if I drop the number of 40 to 30, I have an even bigger number. as imports go down, it makes the net export amount even bigger.
Okay.
It's not exports plus imports. It's
But
exports.
the net capital outflow equals net export.
Yes.
So, but
Yes.
you're doing less imports, your dollar value is going down, it's depreciating.
But we already had the depreciation part. The depreciation part led to the increase in the net exports.
But it also leads to
Less net capital outflow, but that's also happening just by our initial discussion. That's the thing, like when I explain this, there's different ways of looking at it. At the end of the day, it's like what is before and what is after. Drop in interest rate, I said, what's going to happen to the money coming in? Will more money come in or less? The answer was less. Less money coming in. So that kind of idea there. So it's they are linked. So net capital outflow and net exports are going up. Less money coming in, more out, relatively speaking. Yeah. So different ways of seeing the same picture. But at the end of the day, just find whichever one works for you. And just make sense out of it. Anyways,
I had a question about the aggregated supply.
Mm-hmm.
As you say, what affects aggregated supply is change in input costs and in technology. But if that's only in the long run, not in the short run.
Why not in the short run? Why in the long run?
Because it's written in the book that's not in the short run. And
What's in the short run?
In the short run, there's the three theories on wages, price, and...
So how's wages not an input cost?
Okay. And malicious theory, misperception theory.
So there might be, maybe. But wages is an input cost. Okay. So like changes in the price of oil or changes in wages will shift the AS curve. Unless I got something wrong the last 10 years in teaching this class. Yeah. So that's what's going on here. So in this situation that we had, the price of oil going up, AS going left, we would have this situation here that due to this increase in the price of oil, we kind of went from this stable situation to this situation over here. And it kind of makes sense. Like imagine like tomorrow the price of gasoline would go up to $3 a liter. I always like to push things to the extreme because it's much easier to visualize afterwards. If the price of gasoline goes up to $3 a liter, we would expect a lot of industries to struggle because now they're facing much higher costs. They might not be able to pass on that cost to the consumer. They might not produce as much. And we expect things to cost more. So it's kind of intuitive to think that production will fall to a certain extent and goods in society will go up in price. It's pretty intuitive. So always kind of push it to the extreme and you'll get the intuition behind it. But this situation here, because the new short-run equilibrium, which is the intersection between the two kind of sloping curves, is to the left, means that we're going through a recessionary output gap. And a recessionary output gap can solve itself over time without the need for government intervention through monetary or fiscal policy. However, it has its disadvantages. And we'll kind of talk about that once we get into that versus this. But overall, the disadvantage in this case, the main one, is that it's a slow process. Okay? Why is it a slow process? Well, I mentioned this to her before class, and I'll mention this to everyone after class. When we have government intervention, so I'll just note it somewhere because it's just an easy thing to remember, and hopefully you do. When we have government intervention, it's always going to be the AD curve that will move. Because I said through government intervention, fiscal or monetary policy was either investment and net exports that would change or government spending and consumption. So it's always AD. But when there is no government intervention, which is just kind of like there's different ways of calling it, like a laissez-faire economy, which is just like the words say in French, like laissez-faire, like just let the economy be. Or it's just that classical economics of just no government intervention, or what maybe more right-wing people would kind of want is just let the economy recover on its own. Well, in those situations there, because the government's not stimulating the economy through changes that lead to changes here, it's the AS curve that's going to change. And how is the AS curve going to change? What's going to be the magic thing is going to be wages. Okay? So wages are what's going to bring the economy back to full employment. So think about a recession, like forget about the graph for a second here and think about a recession. So when I started teaching, it was like 10 years ago, and it was just after 2008 financial crisis. And there was parts of the world that were like, had really high levels of unemployment. We're talking about like 30-ish% in Spain and other parts like that. So like super high unemployment. So you would think in times of that the economy is doing well and everyone's trying to get you to work for them because like everything's booming, you would probably see like wage rises. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But in times where things are going bad, you would typically see wages falling. But you could quickly imagine that people would be reluctant to accepting lower wages. Imagine you've been doing the same job for a few years and you're paid like $50,000 to do it. And then your employer goes to see you and he says, well, the economy's not doing so well, so keep doing what you're doing, but I'll only pay you $35,000 this year. You know, like it'd be a hard pill to swallow. So it's not something that a lot of people would be like, yeah, here, I'll sign and I'm happy to serve you at a lower price. You know, it's not something that will be adopted fast. But the flip side is really quick. If you've been paid $50,000 for many years to do a job and now the economy is booming and your boss says, hey, I really want to keep you. I don't want you to see this competitor. I know he's trying to get you. I'll give you $65,000 to do the exact same thing you used to be doing. Then you'll be like, okay, sign it off and you'll be happy to do so. So wage increases people will accept fast. Wage decreases people will not accept. But you have to understand that if for a certain period of time people are not able to get jobs, you might accept lower wages. Not very common, but there's other things that mimic that. And this is where inflation kind of has its purpose in a certain way. People don't like the feeling of accepting lower wages, but if you tell someone, you know, normally you get like a 2% rise in salary from year to year with your collective agreement. Well, now we're going to negotiate for the next 3 years, like you'll have 0% increase in your wages. Okay? That is a very subtle way to say your wages are pretty much going down 2% the next 3 years. That's what it's saying. Like if you're paid a certain amount of money and normally it always goes up by 2%, and for the next so long it doesn't, it's a subtle way of saying that your wages aren't going up. They're actually going down, realistically speaking, because you have less purchasing power. Yes?
So when you say there's no government intervention and that shifts the AS curve,
Yeah.
but like, aren't the governments the one who set, like at least in Canada, they're the ones who set like the wage?
They only set the minimum wage. They don't set the wage. My wage is not mandated by the government.
Yeah.
Most people that work are not mandated by the government. The government only mandates the very minimum that someone could pay someone else. That's the only thing it
But
mandates.
that also affects like for example, if like the way like the general minimum wage goes up, that still affects everybody.
It does to a certain extent, and you would expect, once again, if we're going through a really hard recession, it probably wouldn't be the year that the government would decide to increase minimum wage a lot. So they'd probably keep it stable for a little while due to that. And people would understand that because if everyone's struggling to get a job, they're not as pushing for a higher salary in those periods of time. So, because they want to keep their job, that's the biggest thing. So, but I agree to a certain extent, but at the same time, there's a lot of people that work that aren't at minimum wage and aren't impacted by that. They are impacted by what you purchase. Maybe your A&W burger is a little bit more expensive because the minimum wage went up, but otherwise, your own salary hasn't changed that much. So yeah, coming back to inflation, and during that period of the financial recession, like some companies, like car companies, were deciding where to locate and they're hesitating between different areas. And like sometimes what they would negotiate would be like, we're gonna locate here, but your workers will have like no increase in wages for the next 10 years or something else. And it's just a way of saying, well, we'll pay you, But like realistically speaking, every year your salary is kind of going down a little bit. And it's just different ways of getting back towards this full employment potential. So anytime you don't have a wage increase or your real wage is going down, or if you lose your job and then you accept a lower paying job, even though it's got the same duties and everything else, it's just because we're in a bad market right now. Well, as soon as all of those things happen, it's going to lead to the AS curve to start shifting back until we reach this point again. So there's been an increase in one cost of production, but there's been a decrease in another cost of production to bring us back to full employment. That's the general idea. Okay. We'll see later on that there's kind of trade-offs between letting the economy recover on its own and the government intervening. And one of those trade-offs with the government intervening fast, in this case here, if we could just imagine we started at B and we have the AD curve shifting right instead. Well, the price level went up initially due to this increase in the price of oil, and due to the stimulation, it went up even further. Well, if we keep in mind that the Bank of Canada has a target inflation rate of 2% in the 1 to 3% range, if this is going beyond that 3%, they probably will not like that. They won't allow it. But if we're also going through a really hard recession and the wages are actually falling and the price of the goods in the economy are actually falling, they wouldn't like that either. So it'll be kind of a combination of the two that can happen in a certain way. But it's just something good to understand that if the government decided just to step out and not do anything, it's wages that would adjust, that would bring us back to full employment. Yeah. And in practice, in a country like Canada, it's very rarely going to be this that's going to solve recessions. You look at 2008 and you look at now, the government's pumping money into the system, like the PCU and everything else. It's like it's a way of stimulating consumption through government spending. You know, it does happen. So it's a baseline that's good to understand, but in practice, obviously, there is a little bit more to it than that. Any other questions here? So understanding the AS shifts, like I said, are these. So input costs deals with oil and everything else, but always keep in mind wages. And that will shift the AS curve left or right. Let's come back to the questions I could have had here. Okay, I guess I'll make that clear again. Can someone explain to me why wages falling will make the aggregate supply curve shift right? Like I take it as given now, but I understand that it shouldn't. Why, as wages fall, or the opposite here, as price of oil goes up, why does AS curve shift left or right? Like, because otherwise you might get confused and do the wrong direction on an exam. Yeah.
Does it cost less to produce the same goods?
Yeah, so if I just zone in on the supply curve here, this is my aggregate supply curve, this is my price, and this is my quantity or my supply curve in microeconomics. Well, so to understand and to just kind of always comprehend which direction things are going to shift, my biggest advice is always just to kind of look at one point and then ask yourself one of two questions. So here, if I focus on this point here right now, I could ask myself one of two questions. One is, after this change in wages, if the price of the good is the same, will I want to supply more or less than before? But when I look at supply, I rather see the other one. I could see if I were to ask you to keep on supplying the same quantity as before, and the wages are cheaper, will you require me to pay more than before? Or will you be willing to supply it at a lower price? Well, if your employees cost you less, will you need to be paid more for your goods, or are you willing to accept less? Your employees cost less. You're willing to accept less. Yes, so if your employees cost less, like in use and your threshold price was $10, well, if your employees cost less, maybe now your threshold price is $9 to sell the same product. So it just kind of makes sense out of it. And that way you won't need to kind of remember everything by heart. So as wages fall, which is a cost of production, such as technology or electricity or raw materials, as those things fall in price for the same quantity that the supplier was supplying at a certain price before, he'll be willing to supply at a lower price. But on the flip side, the example I had over here, if the supplier was supplying it at a certain price, but now the price of gasoline goes up to $3 a liter, and the shipment of their goods coming from Africa is more expensive, and everything else, the driving around and everything else, more expensive, well, then they'll have to charge a higher price to compensate for that higher expense to conduct their business. So, yeah, that's why AS shifts left to right. Okay. And when we think of aggregate demand, why it shifts left or right, it's the same kind of idea. Aggregate demand, if I look at a specific price and I had like my aggregate demand curve, if all of a sudden there's an increase in investment, well, for that same price, there's going to be a greater quantity of products demanded and so on, because there's more investment going on. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, they kind of go over and say like, if it's a positive effect for a company, then it shifts right. If it's a negative effect for a company, it shifts left. Would that also be true with aggregate demand and not just supply?
So, yeah, you could see that. Like, it's a shortcut I don't use in my own mind, but it would make sense as well if I think of the supply side. If it's something good for the company, like better technology or lower cost of production, AS shifts right. And if it's something good on the demand side, it would also shift right, yes. Yeah, that works. If that makes sense to you and you'll remember that, yeah, use it for sure. Anyone else want to try their trick to remembering? So, yeah, that's that. Let me see what else I got here for questions if you guys don't have any. Okay. That's pretty much it for the previous questions I had for this class. Yeah. So, to start, just kind of talking quickly, fiscal and monetary policy is really going to be the same kind of analysis, but looking at the impacts of increases in government spending or drops in interest rates on aggregate demand. And we kind of introduced a lot of it already, so even though it's kind of like 2 chapters in one, it's not going to be that dense in information. There's going to be certain things that you have to know from those chapters, but overall it's the same kind of analysis that goes on. And, okay, so coming back to this idea of why this situation where all 3 intersect are seen as a stable situation, it's because it's a situation where wages are not going to adjust anymore. We're kind of stable. Everyone's kind of happy. We're at a level of unemployment that makes sense. When we were in a recessionary output gap, it made sense for people to start accepting lower wages to obtain employment or to keep employment. And if we are in the boom phase, on the other hand, so let's say I were to draw a boom phase, well, we're in a situation where, let's say, my classic example, that today Pfizer announced that they have this potential vaccine for COVID. Well, let's say Pfizer was producing this in Canada, and all of a sudden it leads to a major increase in our exports once it's ready. So this could be Q or Y. I don't really mind what you put here. This would lead to an increase in our aggregate demand because there's an increase in our exports, right? So for an exam question, typically, like my essay questions I would have had, or problem sets, and I might have a version of this on this version of the exam. I'll find a way to spin it, so I'll give you guys a hint on what I used to ask, and probably will have a similar question in this exam. What I'll often start with is a situation of long-run equilibrium. Okay? In that situation of long-run equilibrium, when I say that, or I say a situation where the economy is stable over time, it's always going to be that situation here where all three curves intersect. Always, always, always. So if I'm asking that question, I'm asking you to set it up. Normally I'd ask you to draw it, but because the draw function doesn't work too well on Moodle, I might have 4 different graphs that I will have pre-drawn for you, maybe, who knows. And if that is the section, make sure that the one that is the stable one is the one that they're all intersect, okay? And then typically I'd have a news event, and the news event could go on any lines. It could be like there's an increase in demand for exports due to finding a COVID vaccine in Canada, or there's an increase in the demand for imports from another country due to them finding the vaccine, or whoever. So it could be whatever story it is, or it could be like a housing crisis like we had. And then that leads to another situation. So once again, if it's you guys drawing it, well, you would have drawn here and you would have said, well, we started at point A and now we are at point B. But it might be something pre-drawn that goes from point A to point B, and you have to just tell me which of the curves makes most sense. So like I said, if you have a question along those lines, you could draw it out yourself and then look at which one corresponds to what you would have drawn instead of looking at them all. So this is the situation that we have here. Well, in this situation, the short run situation, we are producing at Y1, we're producing more than Y star or Y hat, the potential output. Okay. And this situation here is called an inflationary output gap, and it's not stable. Once again, stable is only on when all three intersect. Why is this side not stable either? Why isn't everyone working 60, 70 hours a week not stable? Well, you'll be in a situation where you're working somewhere and you'll have people fighting to get you. Like for a short amount of time, you might be willing to work more. Like if you have a family and everything else, you won't want to work like 90 hours a week the rest of your life, unless you like that kind of stuff. But you'll have the situation where if there's a lot of people that want to hire you, you'll be bouncing around between different jobs, or you'll stay at the same job, but they'll start paying you more. So in these booming phases, you'll have increases in wages. So a boom phase, like there's a strong demand for labor. Which leads to an increase in wages. It's always going to be the case. As soon as there's a boom phase, it could be in one industry only, but it could be in the whole economy as well. As soon as there's a boom phase and that every business is struggling to find someone to work for them and they're working hard at trying to grab them and keep them, there's going to be an upward pressure on wages. As this upward pressure on wages arises, we know that the AS curve will start moving. Increase in wages will lead to what? This kind of situation here. Always ask yourself the question, and the answer is right here, but always ask yourself the question, if I were to produce the same quantity as before, do I need to be paid more than before or less? I'm paying my workers more, I will charge a higher price as well. Shift left. Okay? So the AS curve will start shifting left up to the point where we reach a new equilibrium where all three curves intersect. This old one doesn't exist anymore because the 80 curve had already shifted, but this is an 80 curve that is still present, this is an AS curve that is now, and this is the LRAS. So this is a stable situation, whereas the first one was also stable. But there was a perturbation, there was a shock that happened that threw us off this stable course. Stable, the markets were stable, well-functioning economy, not too much unemployment. We could either shift towards a recession, people lose their jobs, wages start going down, or we could shift to a boom phase where people start seeing their wages go up. But at the end of the day, potential output, if technology hasn't changed, people haven't died, and immigration hasn't changed, the amount of shirts that we'll produce will be the same. Output levels are the same. Just the price level has changed. Okay? So this is what happens when the government does not intervene. And once again, we'll see that in this case here, when we're going through a boom phase, maybe the government's going to want to intervene and slow down the economy so that we don't suffer too much inflation, too much increases in prices. But if you understand this well, everything else becomes clear after. Questions? Comments? Brain is saturated for today. Probably is. I'll leave you guys to it. I'll see you guys next week, hopefully, but otherwise, we'll keep in touch.